Welcome to the episode, and today we focus on Abu Yusuf Yaqub ibn Ishaq al-Kindi, a man famously honored in history as the philosopher of the Arabs. A direct descendant of Arab kings and son of the Emir of Kufa, Al-Kindi was a pioneer who became the first to make explicit use of the Greek philosophy while writing in Arabic. Operating within the intellectual ferment of the 9th century Baghdad, Al-Kindi oversaw a circle of translators who rendered an astonishing range of the Greek scientific and philosophical texts into Arabic. He wasn't merely a passive recipient of these works. He corrected and improved them and shaped a new philosophical vocabulary to solve the contemporary problems in Islamic theology. He famously championed the value of the foreign wisdom and asserted that truth is valuable wherever we find it. And he sought to demonstrate the great harmony between Greek reason and Islamic revelation. In this episode, we'll explore the core pillars of the Al-Kindi's thought, like metaphysics as theology. And here we will look at his masterpiece on first philosophy, where he defines the highest science as the study of God, the true one, a principle so absolute that no human predicate can fully describe him. And then the origin of the universe. And here we will discuss his rejection of the Aristotelian thesis that the world is eternal, and drawing instead on the argument of the Christian commentator John Philoponus to prove that the universe must have a beginning. And finally, a unified science, where we'll see how Al-Kindi integrated the diverse fields from astrology and optics to ethics, and considering the heavens an instrument of the divine providence and philosophy as the path to cleaning the mirror of the soul. Al-Kindi's work inaugurated the tradition of philosopher, setting the stage for every major philosopher who followed him. So join us and examine the life and legacy of the thinkers who first bridged the world of Greeks and the world of Islam.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're looking at a stack of incredibly fascinating materials, specifically scholarly excerpts from Philosophy in the Islamic World and the Cambridge Companion to Arabic Philosophy.
It's a really great stack of sources today.
It really is. And our mission for you today is to shatter this massive historical myth about how ancient Greek knowledge survived. We're going to introduce you to these 9th century intellectual pioneers who didn't just passively preserve ancient wisdom, but they actively dubbed it. They remixed it to fit a completely new world.
We absolutely did.
So we've got royal PR campaigns, philosophical forged identities, and ancient action at a distance ray theories.
Right.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand these brilliant minds, we first have to understand the massive state-sponsored machine that brought them their information.
Right. And what we're going to see today is going to change how you view the entire history of human thought. I mean, it proves that knowledge is never just passively handed down. It's actively transformed. But yeah, to start, we have to talk about the Abbasid translation movement.
Right. So we're talking late 8th century here.
Exactly. Late 8th century, moving into the 9th century, you have these incredibly wealthy, powerful caliphs, specifically Al-Mansur and later Al-Ma'mun, and they are pouring just vast amounts of state wealth into translating Greek scientific and philosophical texts into Arabic.
It's a massive undertaking.
It is, and you often hear about the famous House of Wisdom, right? The Beit al-Hikmah.
Oh, right. The grand ancient research university with scholars debating in marble halls.
Well, yes, but the historical record shows that's a bit of an inflated claim.
Wait, really? So it wasn't this massive university?
Not really. I mean, some research like astronomical observations certainly happened under royal patronage, but the House of Wisdom itself was primarily a powerful library. It was staffed much more by copyists and bookbinders than by, chemists and biologists. But you should never underestimate the power of a well-funded library. Actually, you can still see the linguistic legacy of this today. Like, the English word alchemy comes from the Greek word chemia, but with the Arabic definite article al added to it.
Oh, wow. Alchemy. That makes total sense.
Right. But their motivations weren't just about abstract intellectual curiosity. They wanted practical tools.
Yeah, reading through the sources. They wanted medical texts, engineering.
And astrology, which was huge for imperial propaganda. If you can predict the future, or at least convince people you can by mapping the stars, that's a highly effective tool for legitimizing your dynasty.
That's fascinating. And they also wanted weapons for religious debate, right? Like Aristotle's logic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that brings us right back to the dubbing problem. How do you map the concepts of Greek culture onto Arabic without altering the meaning?
Okay, yeah. There's this brilliant analogy from the text about modern German television that I loved. So, you know how in English we just have one word for you, but German has a formal you and an informal you, sie and du. So a German dubber translating an American sitcom has to make this massive interpretive choice every time a character says you.
All right, they have to decide the relationship between the characters. Are they friends? Are they respectful colleagues?
Exactly. And the Arabic translators faced that exact dilemma, but with foundational philosophical concepts. Like, take the Greek word eidos. Aristotle used it constantly. It can mean form or it can mean species. But Arabic has two distinct words for those. Sura for form and na for species. So the translator had to decide in every single sentence what Aristotle meant. Does this mean they were fundamentally changing the philosophy as they translated it?
What's fascinating here is that, yes, translation is always interpretation. By making those choices, they set the trajectory for all future readers. And they were also doing this as a form of cultural one-upmanship against the Christian Byzantine Empire.
Really? How so?
Well, they were essentially claiming to take wisdom back from the Greeks, like, we understand your ancestors better than you do.
That is such a power move. But wait, if the Abbasids were in a rivalry with the Christian Byzantines, how did they actually get their hands on these Greek texts? And who was translating them?
Right, because there's this popular myth that Muslims just found dusky Greek texts in a vault, blew the dust off, and sparked a renaissance.
Right. But that's not what happened.
No, not at all. That myth completely ignores the crucial role of Syrian Christians. There was no gap in history. You had an unbroken chain of knowledge.
Okay, so the Syrian Christians were the middlemen.
Yes. They spoke Syriac, which is a Semitic language like Arabic and Hebrew. So you had the Neoplatonic schools in Alexandria passing knowledge to Syriac monasteries like CIISR. And those monks eventually translated Greek into Syriac, and then later that Syriac was translated into Arabic.
Okay, but I have to push back here. Why were devout Christian monks spending their time meticulously translating the logic of a pagan Greek philosopher like Aristotle? Weren't they worried about the theology?
It's a fair question, but for these Syriac Christians, Aristotle's logic wasn't a threat, it was a propedeutic.
A propedeutic, like a preliminary study.
Exactly. It was a foundational tool. They believed you had to master logic to become a philosopher. And for them, that philosophical training culminated in Christian theology, specifically the theology of the pseudo-Dionysius and Christian asceticism.
Ah, so they were using pagan logic to prove Christian theology.
Exactly. They stripped it of its pagan context and used the rigorous mechanics of it.
Okay, so this continuous chain of Syriac translators eventually leads us to 9th century Baghdad, where we get these highly specialized translation rings. And the sources contrast two main groups.
Right, you have Hunayn ibn Ishaq's circle, which was highly accurate.
Yeah, they translated from Greek to Syriac to Arabic, mostly focusing on Galen. But then we have our main protagonist today, the Kindi circle.
Oh, the Kindi circle. Their translations were notoriously overly literal. Sometimes they were completely incomprehensible.
Yeah, the reading mentioned that Averroes later had to basically guess what the Arabic gibberish meant in the Metaphysics.
Because he didn't have the original Greek to compare it to.
But here's where it gets really interesting. They might have been clunky translators, but they took absolutely shocking liberties. They took the writings of Neoplatonists like Plotinus and Proclus, heavily edited them, and passed them off as works by Aristotle.
Right, which is a massive historical sleight of hand.
I mean, Proclus's Elements of Theology became the Book of Causes, and Plotinus's Enneads became the famous theology of Aristotle. It's like taking a generic smartphone, slapping an Apple logo on it, and selling it as the new iPhone. If you want to make a text a medieval bestseller, just say Aristotle wrote it.
Exactly. But it wasn't just for sales. It was intentional philosophical engineering.
Engineering? How?
They changed Plotinus's text to protect Aristotle from criticism. And they tweaked the theology to make the abstract Neoplatonic one sound like the creator god of the Abrahamic faiths.
Oh, wow. So they Islamicized it?
Precisely. They used Islamic theological terms, like sifat, which means divine attributes. You have to remember, they were tailoring this text specifically for the caliph's son. Making it politically and religiously acceptable was the priority.
Okay, so the mastermind overseeing all this creative translation was Al-Kindī himself, the philosopher of the Arabs.
Yes, he had to bridge the gap between ancient pagan thought and his devout Muslim elite sponsors.
And he even boasted a royal Arab tribal lineage, right? He was the tutor to the caliph's son. I love the comparison the author makes in the text. They compare Al-Kindī to the silent film star Buster Keaton.
It's a great analogy. Both were pioneers in a brand new medium.
Right. Buster Keaton was figuring out the language of cinema, and Al-Kindī was figuring out how to do Greek philosophy explicitly in Arabic. He was essentially acting as a PR man for Greek thought.
He really was. You see it in his masterpiece on First Philosophy. He argues against conservative religious scholars, insisting that truth is valuable wherever it comes from.
Yeah, because they were saying, we have the Quran, we don't need this foreign stuff.
Exactly. And to prove his point, he uses rigorous Greek logic to defend the absolute core of Islamic belief. Tawhid, the absolute oneness of God.
Right, and he uses this concept of negative theology, drawing on Porphyry's izagoge, the categories. And this brings up the elephant analogy from the reading, which I loved. Let's walk through that.
Sure. So if you look at an elephant, you can categorize it. You can say it weighs 2 tons.
Right, which is the category of quantity.
Exactly. Or you can say it's 20 years old. That's the category of time.
But Al-Kindī points out that every time you apply a category to something, you are implying multiplicity. You're saying it has parts.
Right. If something exists in time, it has a past, present, and future. It's divided.
So therefore, if God is the true one, absolutely perfect and unified, none of those categories can apply to him. God can't have quantity or time. He is pure oneness.
Exactly. He logically strips away every conceivable human descriptor because descriptors imply limitations.
But wait, if God is purely one and completely detached from all these categories, how do we even talk about him? It sounds like Al-Kindī is painting himself into a theological corner where God is just silence.
It's a valid concern. And actually, he used this exact logic to refute the Christian Trinity.
Oh, right, because saying God is 3 persons introduces quantity.
Exactly. But to avoid the trap of total silence, Al-Kindī allowed for a few specific concepts. He argued that God is an agent, the only true agent who brings being from non-being.
Ah, okay. So God isn't just an abstract concept, he actively creates.
Yes. But that brings us to the mechanics of the universe. If God is this pure one, how does he interact with the messy physical world?
The humans and the elephants.
Exactly. Al-Kindī actually disagreed with Aristotle on this. Aristotle thought the universe was eternal.
Right, that it had always existed.
But Al-Kindī needed to align with Islamic creation, ex nihilo creation out of nothing. So he used a Christian commentator, John Philoponus, to prove that time cannot be infinite. The universe had a beginning.
Okay, so God creates the universe. But how does he control it?
God is the remote cause, but the heavens, the stars, they are the proximate instrument of divine providence.
The tool God uses.
Right. And Al-Kindī had 2 conflicting scientific theories about how this worked. One was the Aristotelian view of cosmic friction.
Wait, cosmic friction, like the heavenly spheres physically rubbing together.
Exactly. The idea was that they rub together as they rotate, and that massive friction stirs up the elements on Earth. Earth, air, fire, water, and causes all change in weather.
That's wild. What was the other theory?
It was a Euclidean geometrical approach, a ray theory. He argued for action at a distance where stars shoot literal straight rays of power down to influence the Earth.
Oh, wow. And that's how he justified astrology.
Yes, because if stars shoot geometric rays that physically alter the Earth, you can predict the future by mapping the stars.
He even applied that to optics, didn't he? The extramission theory?
Right, the idea that our eyes physically shoot out visual rays to see objects. He was desperately trying to synthesize everything, geometry, physics, logic, theology, into one cohesive system.
And where did the human soul fit into all these cosmic rays and friction?
He viewed the soul as a simple, immaterial substance. Its ultimate goal was to strive upward toward the intellectual world, escaping the physical world. He drew heavily on Stoic ethics for this, like Epictetus.
So, detaching from physical desires and mastering your emotions.
Exactly.
But that creates a huge tension for me. If philosophers like Al-Kindī have to spend decades studying math, optics, and Greek logic to understand the universe and elevate their soul, what does that mean for prophets? Does a philosopher think they are better than a prophet?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's a dangerous question. But Al-Kindī navigated it brilliantly. He argued that philosophers and prophets arrive at the exact same truth.
The exact same truth.
Yes, the only difference is efficiency. The philosopher spends a lifetime slowly climbing the mountain. The prophet, by God's will, receives the truth instantly and clearly.
Wow. So they are on the exact same page, just taking different paths.
Exactly.
Okay, let's bring this all together. Think back to our movie dubbing analogy at the start. We looked at how a script gets fundamentally altered for a new audience. Al-Kindī and his circle of translators did exactly that on a cosmic scale. They took Greek philosophy, Neoplatonism, Syriac logic, and Abbasid propaganda and they dubbed it all into a brand new intellectual language.
They absolutely did.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? It means the ideas you take for granted today about science, religion, the universe, they were fiercely debated and hybridized by people trying to make sense of a rapidly changing world.
And it leaves you with a really provocative thought to mull over.
Yeah.
If the foundational texts of Western and Islamic philosophy were so heavily edited, culturally dubbed, and creatively repackaged to satisfy the political and theological needs of 9th century caliphs, how much of what we accept as objective historical truth today is actually just a translation of a translation? How much of your core worldview was fundamentally shaped by the PR needs of an era you barely know existed?
Wow. The lips are moving, but maybe we're all just reading from a dubbed script. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.